Hey guys! Alright, so we are talking about relative frequency in this video. Do keep in mind that this Friday, October 24th, we do have a quiz and you will see relative frequency on it. So our essential question is, what is relative frequency? Well, relative frequency is the ratio of successful outcomes to the total number of outcomes. Alright, so how do we solve that? Well, to solve relative frequency, we just put the number of successful outcomes over the number of total outcomes. Writing relative frequency is very similar to writing probability. So let me show you what I mean. So here in example 1, it says, your team won 9 games out of a total 12 games played. So the frequency of winning, right here, that just means how many times did we win the game. Well, we won 9 times, so the frequency of winning would just be 9. What's the relative frequency of winning? Well, the relative frequency, we have the number of successful outcomes over the total. So our successful outcomes here would be 9 wins. So 9 wins over 12 total games. So we would get 9 over 12. And whenever we reduce that, we get 3 over 4. And yes, you do need to simplify your fractions in these problems. So relative frequency, it's just the total number of something that you're looking for out of the total number of outcomes. So let's look at example 2 together. Let me zoom in. Alright, so you spin a spinner divided into 3 equal sections. You spin it 30 times, complete the table. Alright, well here's our spinner. It has 3 sections, A, B, and C. And we actually already have our data right here. So frequency, that just means how many times did it occur. So frequency for A, we have to count how many times the spinner actually landed on A. And if we count our tally marks, it landed on A 10 times. What's the frequency of B? Well, that would be 5, 10, 11, 12. The frequency of C would be 5, 6, 7, 8. And then our total, which we already know should be 30 from the instructions, 10 plus 12, that's 22, plus 8 is 30. Now we have to find our relative frequency. Okay, so relative frequency, that's our number of successful outcomes out of the total number of outcomes. So for the relative frequency of A, we have 10 out of 30 times, and we can reduce that to 1/3. For the relative frequency of B, we have 12 out of 30 times, which we can reduce to 4 over 10. And then for the relative frequency of C, we have 8 out of 30 times, which we can reduce to 4 over 15. Now the total for relative frequency, we're going to add up our fractions. So it's very important that you don't just write the simplified version, because it's much easier to add if you leave the fractions this way. So we have a common denominator of 30 here. Then we just add 10, 12, and 8, which we know is 30. Our total is 30 over 30, which equals 1 whole. Alright. Let me zoom out for a second. I want you to do the you try section on your own. I want you to pause and work these out and then hit play and we'll go over them together. Okay, so on number 1, it says you flip a coin 15 times and it lands on tails 3 times. Okay, so what is the frequency of tails? Well, it landed on tails 3 times. What is the relative frequency of tails? Well, it landed on tails 3 times out of 15 total, which we can reduce to 1/5. Now, what's the frequency of it landing on heads? Well, if it was flipped a total of 15 times, and 3 of those times were tails, well, 15 minus 3 is 12. So the frequency of heads would have to be 12. So the relative frequency of heads would be 12 out of a total of 15, which we can reduce to 4 over 5. On number 2, It says you roll a 6-sided die 20 times. Complete the table. Well, here's our data from a roll of 20 times. So let's figure out our frequency and relative frequency for each one. Alright, so the frequency of it landing on 1, well, that happened 2 times. For the frequency of 2, that was 5, 6 times. The frequency of 3, that was 3 times. The frequency of 4 was 5 times. The frequency of 5 was 1 time. And the frequency of 6 was 3 times. Now we have to add them up and find our total, which should equal 20 because we already know it was rolled 20 times. So we have 8 plus 3, which is 11, plus 5 is 16, plus 1 is 17, plus 3 is 20. Our total comes out to 20. Okay, now for relative frequency. For 1, it landed on 1 2 times out of 20 total, which we can reduce to 1/10. It landed on 2 6 times out of 20 total, which we can reduce to 3/10. It landed on 3 3 times out of 20, and we cannot reduce that. For 4, it landed on 4 5 times out of 20, which we can reduce to 1/4. It landed on 5 1 time out of 20. We cannot reduce that. And then it landed on 6 3 times out of 20, which we cannot reduce. So, looking at our fractions here that have the common denominator for our total, I know my total is going to have a denominator of 20. Then I just add all of these numerators up, which are the exact same thing as the frequency. So I know they're going to add up to 20. And 20 over 20 equals 1 whole. Now, I want you to notice something. When we found our total for relative frequency up in our example 2, the total for the relative frequency added up to 1. Well, the total for the relative frequency for rolling a die also added up to 1. So, I want you to make a note. Total relative frequency equals 1 whole. So anytime you add up all of your relative frequencies, the sum should always be 1 whole. And that is a good way to check your relative frequency. If you add them up and you do not get 1 whole, then you know you made a mistake and you can go back and check. Make sure you have filled in every part of your notes. This will go on page 31 of your spiral. Be prepared to work with this in class on Wednesday. Have a good evening. I'll see you tomorrow.